Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had arisen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them, walking on water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called out to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed.
How does this story fit into what Matthew is saying?
Well, so Matthew spent the first half of his story, his gospel, about Jesus setting up conflict, conflict in the world that needs rescue or some kind of response. He starts locally. We hear all about Herod, who's this local strong man who's taking out anybody that's like questioning his power. And fun fact, he puts a hit out on Jesus. That's interesting. But then there's like bigger civil unrest. The primary audience that Matthew's writing to is the Jewish audience, and they have this deep abiding sense that the land in which they live, the promised land, is occupied, and it is, by the Romans, and that needs to change. And then they go to the temple, to the religious leaders, people like me, for some word of consolation or hope or from God about all this stuff. And, they're constantly left wanting. And so Matthew's really just reminding people of what they already know. Like, the world is broken and it's in need of rescue. And more importantly, like, if you want to follow Jesus, like if you want to be a part of that life, then you'd better be ready to be a part of that rescue mission, to go into a world that's broken, a world that's more or less caught up in a storm. So that's where we're at in the story.
Well, planning a wedding during COVID has felt like a storm because we had this plan of what our wedding was going to look like a year ago, and that's totally changed now.
Growing up, I went to majority white schools from kindergarten to 12th grade. It was really hard for me to feel seen and feel like I belonged.
Recently, I've been preparing to go to college, and a lot of stuff has just been really thrown off by what's happening right now. Dates are being changed, times are being changed, the way that we handle everything is being changed. It's just been kind of a challenge for me lately.
So Matthew goes, I guess, talking about these other types of storms to a real one. So, like, what's the significance in that?
Well, by the time we get to chapter 14 in Matthew, he's hitting the gas on what he's trying to tell people about Jesus. And, like I said, Jesus is addressing and providing rescue for these local issues, these speaking truth to power in these civil issues, and he's teaching in these religious contexts. And so there's those solutions. But then we start to see the miracles. Like, Jesus is healing people, and he's casting demons out of folks. And then, like, just before we get to this section, to the storm, he's there with his disciples, and he takes a little bit of food, and somehow, like, when you add up all the women and the children that are there, it feeds 15,000 folks. Like, It's amazing stuff. You know, and it's all stuff that would like change your perspective on who Jesus is, right? But in an odd way, these healings and things like that were like to scale for, you know, a religious miracle worker. You know, within the religious imagination of the first century and in Judaism, there's prophets and they do these kinds of things. But then they're in the storm. And like, if you've ever been in a storm in a little boat on big water, and like, you know, the world gets really big and like it's chaotic, it's out of control, and like you feel super small. But then they look out on the water and they see Jesus. You know, and it's not like these things aren't miraculous, but like they're to scale for what they sort of expected out of a miracle worker. But this storm situation is different, because as they're looking out there, Jesus is standing on the wind and on the waves. He's standing on top of the storm, and like within their religious imagination, there's one connection to them. That's with creation. That's with God. This isn't just like miracle worker type saving and rescue. This is God type rescue. This is big. Jesus is big. And so they're understandably rattled. I mean, I would be. I mean, wouldn't you be?
Well, this past week when we were faced with the notion that we may not be face-to-face with our students for quite a while, that feels a little out of control to me, because I really feed off of that connection with the kids.
Actually, yesterday was a really good example of things starting to spin out of control. I had my immunization records for college apparently didn't go through. I had to take a strengths test. I had to do about 5 different things for college in the span of about 3 hours to catch a Zoom meeting. And it was a lot. It just feels like a lot.
You know, this situation provokes a whole bunch of, I guess, understandable responses in the disciples. You know, you've got some of them that are terrified and clinging to the side of the boat, you know, just fearing for their lives. And then you've got others that are just paddling like crazy, trying to get themselves out of the situation because they're terrified. And then you have what I like to think of as the Scandinavian disciples. They get it. This is how it happens. This is what, you know, they're not going to make it. You know, maybe a little cynical. But in any case, like, a whole range of reactions, and I feel like all of us are there every once in a while in the storms in our life. But then they see Jesus out on the water and they're overwhelmed, and like so much so that the text says that they think he's a ghost. Like, it couldn't be anything but something supernatural and scary, and so they freak out. And like, you know, I think it just demonstrates the reality that storms and Jesus do one thing really, really well. They reveal what's on the inside, and it either terrifies you or it makes you available for where you need to go next. And thankfully, that's what happens with Peter. You see, Peter was looking for God to show up, and then God did show up. And in his fear, God tells him, "Take courage. Don't fear. I'm here." Wild.
So that's when Peter gets out of the boat?
Yeah. And it's because he sees Jesus. Like, he really sees Jesus. You know, I think that Peter's having the sort of reaction that Matthew hopes all of us, you know, will have as a result of reading this story. And it's important to know that Peter's been with Jesus like all along. Like, he's experienced all of the healing and the miracles and all this stuff. Like, he's been experiencing this unfolding revelation of who Jesus is. And so now he's there for this storm, this massive escalation of the picture of who Jesus is, and it moves him to this place of availability. And so, yeah, like, Peter asked Jesus to tell him to walk out on the water, and so I think Jesus gets it that Peter gets it. And so Jesus says, yeah, come.
So he goes out to meet Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine it, like Peter pulling up his shorts and crawling over the side of the boat. And he gets out there, and he too, like, is walking over the storm, like on the wind and the waves. I mean, it's nuts. And he has a response then, like I think that all of us would have. Like, you know, he is having this like out-of-body experience at first, and then all of a sudden, like, he sort of comes to his senses. But it's in coming to his senses that he like realizes that I'm walking on the Sea of Galilee in a storm, and it's overwhelming for him, the reality of it all. And that's when he starts to sink in the water. And, you know, he's in trouble. At least feels like he is.
That we know that Jesus is walking this with us, but there's definitely been times where the fear and the anxiety and just the stress of it all has certainly taken over our emotions and kind of our well-being.
I think the doubt comes from things being completely out of my control, and it has actually caused me to dive deeper into God's Word and into my prayer life and really rely on Jesus more to combat that doubt.
So then what happens?
Well, Jesus does for Peter what I think Jesus does for all of us when, you know, things go sideways, when we sink below the surface in life and the storms that we experience. He reaches into the water and he grabs Peter by the arm and he rescues him. Like, it's this mini demonstration of all that Matthew's telling us about Jesus being the answer to what needs to be rescued. And it's awesome because, like, Jesus does it without condemnation. He does it without shaming Peter. He just rescues him, pulls him up out of the water, and Jesus sees Peter, and it's this amazing moment, like, that we all hope to have with Jesus, you know, in our lives when life is difficult. Jesus lends him his strength, his power, so that he might also continue to walk on the wind and the waves. And the text doesn't have to say it. Like, for us to know that Peter had a life-changing experience that day. He was never going to be the same.
Like, what does that mean for us? I mean, a lot of us feel like we're in this storm right now, you know?
Yeah, I mean, all of us, me included, you know? Like, I've been in quarantine, and I know people that are sick. I'm afraid of getting sick. I know people that have died. I've been to virtual funerals, and I mean, I think what is good news, first of all, in this whole story is that, like, or is good news in the gospel in general and about Jesus' relationship with us, is that he cares about what's going on in our lives. We are invited to lay it all out there, to be honest. This is an invitation to be who we are, you know, failures and all, before our God, and to know that God is interested in the details about the storms of our life and wants to do something about them. Like, I mean, that's good news. and I also think that Jesus isn't leaving me or us where we are. Like, I believe that God is trying to move us from fear to courage. Like, I don't know about you, but like every time I watch the news anymore, it's it's almost oppressive in the way that it's like this highlight reel for fear, designed to like scare us from one another, scare us from understanding each other, scare us from ourselves, and most of all to like scare us from changing or growing. I believe that Jesus came to the disciples and comes to us to unstick us, to move us from being stuck in fear to freedom so that we can follow, to move people from, like he says when he's talking to the disciples, from fear to courage so that we can be the church. I think lastly, it's important to pay attention to the fact that Jesus and Peter don't, after they have this interaction on the water, like they don't just like skip away on this calm sea and go do their own thing. They come back to the boat. They come back to the boat and they lead the disciples to where they were going anyways, to more ministry. Like this story isn't an end in itself. It's a model. It's a pattern for us to follow, for us to know how to be the church. Jesus changes us so that we can go change people's situation. Like I said, we're only halfway through the conflict that Matthew is setting up in this story. And while Peter and the disciples are where they are located in the story as characters in the story, like Matthew's writing this almost half a century after, and we're reading this a couple thousand years after, like after the resurrection, importantly, and after Jesus gives us the Spirit so that we might do for others what he has done for us, which is to show up in each other's storms. For a long, long time, and some of you who have been in old churches, if you stare at the ceiling, like the church has been understood as a boat, a lifeboat of sorts. A boat where people can go for rest and for shelter when life gets rough. And I think while that is absolutely true and appropriate in all times and all places, there's more to it, especially today. Because this boat is filled with known and changed followers of Jesus, so that we can go seek out people that are struggling in the storms of life, so that we can go where they are. And that means it's okay when the building is closed, because the church is never closed. The lifeboat's always moving. And so that's what I'm going to do. I paddled to this side of the lake so that I could join some friends who are going through some storms in their own life, so that we can weather it together. And my hope is that everybody watching, all of you guys, will do the same thing. Because doing that, showing up as the changed church in people's lives in their storms, changes things. Changes us. And that's good news.
How has your church family helped you during this season?
Shortly after everything shut down with COVID, we were in a wilderness series, and I remember to this day, and will continue to remember this all the way through the school year, the sermon about there's always enough for today.
One time when I was at Prince of Peace, I was feeling particularly alone as a biracial woman in this world. And a woman that I did not know at all came up to me and asked if she could sit with me and pray for me. And it was then that I felt seen and felt like I belonged.
I've felt a lot of support by our church family, just by them being genuinely interested in how we're doing and always asking what they can do for us and just showing love.